Snow White, the tale of a naive young woman poisoned by an apple, ultimately finding her happily ever after with a charming prince. But what if I told you that this sweet, hopeful version was a later creation, a sort of makeup for a much darker narrative? The origin of Snow White, especially in the Brothers Grimm's version, is steeped in revenge, obsession, and visceral horror. Are you ready to hear how it all really began? In its oldest form, the story of Snow White did not feature a jealous stepmother but her own biological mother. The transition to a stepmother figure came much later as a way to soften the emotional impact of the tale. But let us return to the Grimm roots. The queen, before being recognized as the classic villain, was a woman consumed by vanity and the desire to be the most beautiful of all. When Snow White was born, the child's beauty was seen by her mother as a kind of blessing, something that affirmed her own superiority. However, as the years passed, little Snow White grew, and her beauty began to eclipse that of her mother. Here lies the most unsettling detail. The queen did not become cruel out of mere jealousy. In many versions of ancient tales, the concept of beauty was directly tied to power and social standing. A woman who lost her beauty was considered inferior, vulnerable, and even disposable. The queen's obsession, then, was not just superficial, it was existential. She could not allow her daughter, now a rival, to take her place. The magic mirror enters the story as a key character at this point. It was not merely a fantastical invention but a reflection of the queen's paranoia. In some interpretations, it was a metaphor for courtly opinions or even a dark magical artifact revealing harsh truths. When the mirror finally proclaimed that Snow White was the fairest of them all, something inside the queen snapped. Maternal affection gave way to hatred. It was at that moment she decided that Snow White could no longer exist. Not as a daughter, not as a rival. The queen's obsession peaked when the mirror, her sole source of validation, confirmed her greatest fear. Snow White was now the fairest of all. In darker versions of the tale, the mirror was not just an enchanted object but an extension of the queen's vanity, perhaps even a manifestation of dark sorcery. Some older interpretations suggest that the mirror was inhabited by an evil spirit whispering cruel advice to the queen, feeding her envy and paranoia. Under this influence, she devised her most horrifying plan: to rid herself of her own daughter, not quickly or discreetly, but with ritualistic violence bordering on cannibalism. The queen commanded a huntsman to take Snow White into the forest under the pretense of a walk. There, he was to kill her, but that was not enough. To prove he had completed the mission, he was to bring back the girl's heart as a trophy. The most disturbing detail? In many versions, the queen intended to eat Snow White's heart, believing that doing so would transfer the youth and beauty of her daughter to herself. The huntsman, though reluctant, led Snow White into the forest. But upon seeing the innocence and fear in the girl's eyes, he could not bring himself to carry out the order. Instead, he killed a boar and delivered its heart to the queen, deceiving her. At that moment, the queen celebrated her macabre triumph. She cooked and ate the heart, believing she had consumed the essence of Snow White. Little did she know, the young girl was still alive, lost in the vastness of the forest, but, for now, free from her mortal influence. When Snow White fled into the forest, she thought she was escaping a cruel fate, but the vast wilderness was no less terrifying. The woods were described as dark, with twisted branches that seemed to grasp at her with every step. For hours, she wandered, hungry and terrified, until she stumbled upon a strange cabin hidden among the hills. The cabin of the Seven Dwarfs, unlike the charming vision popularized by modern versions, was a dirty, disordered place, marked by signs of a rough and isolated life. Every corner seemed to reflect the loneliness and mistrust of its inhabitants. Exhausted, Snow White entered and found a table with small plates and cups, poorly divided food, and beds lined up like a rudimentary military formation. She ate a piece of hard bread and fell asleep. When the dwarfs returned from work at the mine, they were not pleased to find an intruder. These dwarfs, different from the cheerful depictions we know, were described as dark, distrustful, and rough in their manners. Some ancient accounts portray them as earth spirits, almost supernatural beings, closer to gnomes or trolls. Initially, they refused to take her in, but seeing Snow White's beauty and recognizing her usefulness, she could care for the house while they worked. They agreed to let her stay. However, this protection came at a price. Snow White was often reminded that if she left the cabin, she would be vulnerable to whatever lurked in the forest, or worse, to the queen, who was still searching for her. The relationship between Snow White and the dwarfs was distant, almost cold. They treated her more like a servant than a friend. Although they were aware of the danger she faced, their reasons for protecting her were more pragmatic than altruistic. But the cabin, despite everything, was a shelter for Snow White until the queen discovered she was still alive. When that happened, her fury drove her to devise even more sinister assassination attempts. I will continue translating the subsequent sections. Let me process the rest of the document to maintain continuity. The queen, now more paranoid and insane than ever, consulted her mirror again. To her shock, it revealed that Snow White was still alive and remained the fairest of all. Enraged, she resolved to handle matters herself. Thus began her attempts at murder, not with the subtlety of an apple, but with brutal intent. The first attempt involved a cruel plan. The queen disguised herself as a humble peddler and brought with her an enchanted corset whose magic lay in its deadly grip. When she arrived at the cabin, Snow White, ever naive, allowed the peddlers to adjust the corset on her body. The queen tightened the laces so fiercely that Snow White fainted, unable to breathe. Convinced she had killed the girl, the queen left triumphantly. However, the dwarfs returned just in time. Realizing what had happened, they cut the corset's laces, freeing Snow White from imminent death. They warned her of the dangers of opening the door to strangers, but Snow White's naivety would prove to be her fatal flaw. The second attempt was even more macabre. This time, the queen appeared with a poisoned comb coated with a toxic substance that seeped into the scalp upon contact. Once again disguised, she convinced Snow White to let her comb her hair. As soon as the comb touched her locks, Snow White collapsed to the ground, lifeless. The queen left, once again believing she had won. But the dwarfs saved Snow White yet again, removing the poisoned comb and reviving her. Each failure only deepened the queen's obsession, culminating in the third and deadliest attempt, the apple. This was no ordinary poisoned fruit, but a work of pure malice. Half of the apple was red, sweet, and harmless, while the other half was soaked with a deadly poison. Disguised as a peasant woman, the queen bit into the safe side to gain Snow White's trust. Enchanted by the succulent fruit, Snow White could not resist the temptation. With the first bite, the poison coursed through her body, and she fell into a deep sleep indistinguishable from death. This time, not even the dwarfs could save her. Believing Snow White was gone forever, they built her a glass coffin to preserve her untouched beauty. However, this was not the end. Something even more disturbing awaited Snow White in her apparent death. After the queen's third attempt, the bite of the poisoned apple left Snow White in a state that resembled death. Her body lay still, but her appearance remained strangely untouched by time or decay. The young girl seemed merely to be sleeping, her skin as white as snow, lips red as blood, and hair black as ebony. The dwarfs, despite their rough demeanor, were deeply affected by Snow White's apparent death. Unable to bury her, they built a glass coffin so that her beauty could remain visible. This coffin was not merely a memorial but also a prison, a symbol of how the young woman's appearance had become her curse. The forest became Snow White's guardian, with the coffin resting in a clearing where no one dared to interfere, at least until a prince happened to pass by. Unlike the romanticized versions, the prince's appearance was not motivated by pure love or instant attraction. Some versions suggest he became obsessed with Snow White's unblemished beauty. Even in Hert's death, the sight of a seemingly sleeping young woman, preserved in her perfection, stirred something unsettling within him. In older accounts, the prince did not wake her with a kiss, as in modern tales. Instead, he asked the dwarfs to take the coffin to his castle. His desire to possess Snow White, even in her inert state, raises dark questions about necrophilia and obsession. To him, the young woman was more of a treasure to be displayed than a living person. On the way to the castle, however, an unexpected event occurred. One of the servants stumbled, causing the coffin to fall. The impact dislodged the poisoned piece of apple stuck in Snow White's throat, and she awoke. But her resurrection was not met with unbridled joy. When Snow White realized what had happened, the prince taking her body as a trophy, the tale begins to delve into morally ambiguous territory. She accepted her salvation, but did she truly love this man who saw her as a possession? Now that Snow White was alive, one final piece of the dark puzzle remained: revenge against the queen. The queen soon learned that Snow White was not only alive but also preparing to marry the prince. Still consumed by vanity and hatred, she returned to her magic mirror, hoping to hear that she had regained her title as the fairest of all. To her shock, the mirror responded, "Snow White, who now lives as queen, is the fairest of them all." Driven by rage and desperate to destroy her rival once and for all, the queen decided to attend the wedding in disguise, with a new plan in mind. But this time, things would not go as she expected. When the queen arrived at the castle, her presence was quickly noticed. Snow White, now fully aware of the extent of her stepmother's cruelty, ordered her capture. What followed was an act of revenge so brutal that even the dwarfs might have hesitated. As punishment for her atrocities, the queen was condemned to dance to her death, but not in an ordinary manner. Iron shoes were specially forged for her, heated until they glowed red-hot, almost incandescent. The shoes were then placed on her feet, burning her flesh as she was forced to dance before the court. The torment was not brief. The heat of the shoes, combined with the physical strain, caused her to collapse slowly until she finally fell dead. There was no mercy in this punishment, only a grotesque lesson that her obsession with beauty and power had led to her ultimate ruin. Snow White and the prince proceeded with the ceremony, but the atmosphere of celebration was tinged with something macabre. The wedding, which should have been a symbol of a new beginning, also became the stage for a spectacle of brutal revenge, forever sealing the grim legacy of this tale. But even with the queen dead, one question lingers: did Snow White truly achieve her happily ever after? After all, she was now married to a man who had viewed her as a trophy, and the trauma of her experiences in the forest would never fully fade. Thus ends the true and dark story of Snow White, a tale of beauty, envy, and revenge, very different from the sugar-coated version we know. But was it truly a happy ending? Or merely the beginning of another dark story? If you enjoyed this darker version and want to hear about other grim tales or unsettling theories, don't forget to show your support. Your interest helps keep these haunting and fascinating stories coming your way.